No dog should ever have to live through something like this. Dr. James Carter let the words slip out before he could stop himself. He had seen plenty of sad cases in his years as a veterinarian, but as he looked at the trembling golden retriever curled up in the corner of the examination room, he knew something was deeply wrong. The dog, a frail yet beautiful girl with large brown eyes, refused to move. More than that, she refused to show her paws. "Easy there, sweetie. We just want to help you," murmured Sarah, the vet technician, crouching down with a handful of treats. "It's okay. You're safe now." But the dog, newly named Daisy by the shelter staff, stayed frozen. Her front paws were tucked beneath her chest, hidden under her fluffy golden fur, while her back paws curled tightly inward. Every time Sarah or Dr. Carter tried to encourage her to lift one, she would whimper and pull back even more. Dr. Carter frowned, glancing at the paperwork that had come with her. Daisy had been found wandering the streets of a small town in Tennessee, picked up by animal control, and transferred to the loving Paws shelter. There were no reports of an owner looking for her. She had no collar, no microchip. It was as if she had never existed before that day. "We need to see what's going on," Dr. Carter said softly. He reached for a pair of latex gloves, his movements slow and careful, giving Daisy time to adjust. "Sarah, let's try to get a closer look." The moment his hands gently touched one of her paws, Daisy let out a heartbreaking whimper and flinched so violently that she nearly knocked over the exam table. Dr. Carter quickly pulled back, heart aching for her. "Something's not right," he muttered. "We need to do X-rays." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with concern. "I'll get the machine set up." Daisy's distress made it clear that whatever was wrong wasn't just recent. This was pain she had been living with for a long time. It took patience, gentle coaxing, and a heavy sedative. But finally, they managed to position her for imaging. As the X-ray machine whirred to life, Dr. Carter prayed they would find an answer, one that would lead to her healing. Minutes later, as the first images appeared on the screen, Dr. Carter's stomach twisted into a knot. Sarah gasped beside him, covering her mouth with her hand. "No. Oh my gosh." Dr. Carter barely breathed as he examined the results. Every single one of Daisy's claws had been forcibly removed. Not by an accident, not by another animal, but by something far worse. The bone damage, the scar tissue, the unnatural way her toes curled. It all pointed to deliberate cruelty. "This wasn't an injury," Dr. Carter said grimly. "Someone did this to her. Someone took the time to make sure she'd never be able to use her paws properly again." Sarah turned to look at Daisy, still lying sedated on the exam table, her breathing slow and steady. "Who would do something like this?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Dr. Carter didn't have an answer, but he knew one thing for certain. This was no accident. And that meant someone out there had hurt Daisy on purpose. His first instinct was to focus on the dog in front of him to help her heal. But another part of him knew this wasn't just about treating a wounded animal. This was a case of abuse, and whoever had done this could still be out there, could still have other animals suffering under their care. "We're calling the authorities," Dr. Carter said. "Right now." Sarah nodded and grabbed the phone. As she dialed, Dr. Carter looked down at Daisy again, determination settling deep in his chest. Whatever had happened to her, however much pain she had endured, she was safe now. And he was going to make sure she stayed that way. Officer Mark Reynolds arrived at the clinic within 20 minutes. A tall man in his late 40s, he carried the weight of experience in his eyes as he stepped into the exam room. He took one look at Daisy, still groggy from sedation, and then turned his attention to Dr. Carter. "Tell me everything you know," he said, pulling out a small notepad. Dr. Carter explained everything. The way Daisy had refused to show her paws, the X-ray results, the clear evidence of abuse. As he spoke, Officer Reynolds' expression hardened. "This isn't something you see every day," he admitted. "But I can tell you one thing. Whoever did this didn't do it for fun. They had a reason." "A reason?" Sarah asked. "What kind of reason could there be for something so cruel?" Officer Reynolds exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his chin. "People who hurt animals like this usually have patterns. This wasn't just random abuse. It's either punishment or control. Either way, it means someone out there was keeping this dog for a purpose. And we need to find out who." Dr. Carter glanced at Daisy. "What do we do next?" "First," Officer Reynolds said, "I'm going to run her description through missing pet reports. If she had an owner who was looking for her, we need to know. But if she doesn't—" He hesitated. "Then we're looking at something a lot bigger. A case of intentional cruelty that didn't happen overnight." Sarah shuddered. "You think she was part of something worse?" "I think," Officer Reynolds said slowly, "that if someone took the time to mutilate her paws like this, they didn't expect her to run away. And that means they might be looking for her." A heavy silence fell over the room. Dr. Carter reached out and gently stroked Daisy's head. "She's not going anywhere," he said firmly. "She's safe now." But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The next morning, Dr. James Carter arrived at the clinic earlier than usual, his thoughts weighed down by what had happened the previous night. Daisy had stayed at the clinic overnight, curled up in the corner of her kennel, still refusing to put any weight on her paws. He had checked on her several times, bringing her water, speaking to her in a soft voice, letting her know she wasn't alone. Each time, she would lift her head slightly, acknowledge his presence, then rest it back down with a quiet sigh. The trust would take time and patience, but he was ready to give her both. As he stepped into the clinic's back room, Sarah was already there, kneeling beside Daisy's kennel, holding out a bowl of food. "She didn't eat much last night," Sarah said softly, watching as Daisy hesitantly sniffed the bowl. "I don't think she trusts it yet." Dr. Carter crouched beside her, observing the way Daisy's nose twitched. Her eyes darted toward the door, her ears flicking slightly, as if she were listening for something. Or someone. "She's still scared," he said. "But that's normal." Sarah nodded. Officer Reynolds called early this morning. He ran her description through every missing dog report in the state. Nothing. No matches. Dr. Carter's jaw tightened. He had hoped there would be some kind of lead, some piece of the puzzle that would tell them where she came from. But now, it was looking more and more like whoever had hurt Daisy had never intended for her to be found in the first place. "Then we're back to square one," he muttered. Sarah sighed, setting the food bowl down inside the kennel before rising to her feet. "I don't get it. If she was being abused, why let her go at all? Why not just—" She hesitated, shaking her head. "It doesn't make sense." Dr. Carter stood, rubbing the back of his neck. Maybe she wasn't let go. Maybe she escaped. The thought sent a chill down his spine. If Daisy had escaped, that meant whoever had hurt her might still be looking for her. And that meant she wasn't just another stray. She was a dog with a past that someone didn't want uncovered. Sarah shuddered. "I hate thinking about what she's been through." "Me too," Dr. Carter admitted. "But right now, all we can do is make sure she's safe." As if sensing the shift in their conversation, Daisy lifted her head slightly, her deep brown eyes meeting his for the first time with something new, something fragile, yet unmistakable. Hope. Dr. Carter felt a small flicker of warmth in his chest. No matter where she had come from, no matter what had been done to her, she was here now. And she wasn't alone. Later that afternoon, the shelter director, Mrs. Evelyn Porter, arrived at the clinic. A woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes and a warm smile. She had been running the Loving Paws shelter for over 20 years. When she walked in, Daisy immediately pressed herself further into the corner of her kennel, her body language tense. "She's a cautious one," Mrs. Porter observed, setting her purse down on the counter. "She has every reason to be," Sarah replied. "Did Officer Reynolds give you any updates?" Mrs. Porter sighed, crossing her arms. "Nothing helpful yet, but he did say he's reaching out to some contacts in neighboring states, just in case." Dr. Carter leaned against the counter, his mind racing. Daisy didn't just belong to someone, she was part of something. We need to figure out what. Mrs. Porter nodded. "Agreed. But first, we need to focus on getting her comfortable. Has she let you touch her paws yet?" Dr. Carter shook his head. "No, and I don't want to force it. She's already been through enough." Mrs. Porter smiled gently. "Then we'll wait. We'll let her come to us." They spent the next few days following that plan. Slowly, carefully, they worked to gain Daisy's trust. Sarah was the first to get her to take food from her hand. Dr. Carter started sitting with her in the evenings, reading aloud from whatever book he happened to have in his office. Mrs. Porter brought in an old stuffed toy, placing it in the kennel just to see if Daisy would acknowledge it. And then, on the 5th day, something changed. Dr. Carter had just finished checking on a recovering kitten when he heard Sarah's voice from the back room, a mix of shock and excitement. "James, come here, now!" He rushed in, expecting the worst, but instead he found Sarah crouched beside Daisy's kennel, her eyes wide with amazement. "She touched it," Sarah whispered, pointing to the stuffed toy. "She moved it with her nose." Dr. Carter's heart swelled. It was a small thing, but it meant everything. Mrs. Porter, who had just walked in, smiled warmly. "That's trust. She's starting to believe she's safe." Dr. Carter knelt beside the kennel, looking at Daisy with gentle eyes. "Good girl," he murmured. "You're doing so good." And then, for the first time since she had arrived, Daisy moved. Not much, just a slight shift of her weight, but it was enough for Dr. Carter to catch the briefest glimpse of her paws beneath her fur. His breath caught in his throat. There was something else. Something they hadn't seen before. A tiny, faded mark on the underside of her paw. A brand. Dr. Carter's stomach twisted. This wasn't just abuse. This was something much bigger. Something darker. And they had only just scratched the surface. Dr. Carter's pulse pounded in his ears as he carefully studied the mark on Daisy's paw. It was faded, almost as if someone had tried to remove it, but the faint outline was still visible. He swallowed hard, his mind racing. A brand. Not a scar from an injury or an accident. A deliberate mark, a symbol of ownership. He exchanged a glance with Sarah, who had gone pale beside him. "That's a brand, isn't it?" she whispered. "Like the kind they use on livestock." Dr. Carter nodded slowly. "Yes, but this isn't a farm brand. It's too small, too precise." Mrs. Porter stepped closer, her brow furrowed in concern. "Are you saying someone branded her on purpose?" "There's no other explanation," Dr. Carter said grimly. "Someone marked her, and that means she wasn't just a pet. She was owned in a way that goes beyond what we normally see. Sarah shuddered. What kind of person brands a dog? Mrs. Porter exhaled deeply. The kind we need to find before they do this to another animal. Dr. Carter took out his phone and snapped a picture of the mark. It was too faded to make out any clear letters or symbols, but he knew someone would be able to decipher it. I'll send this to Officer Reynolds. Maybe he can track it to something. Sarah gently stroked Daisy's head. The dog remained still, but didn't pull away. It was the closest she had come to relaxing since she arrived. We're going to figure this out, Sarah murmured. No matter what it takes. Dr. Carter sent the picture to Officer Reynolds, including a message explaining what they had found. The reply came faster than he expected. On my way. Don't let anyone near her until I get there. Dr. Carter read the message twice, then looked at the others. He's coming now. Mrs. Porter frowned. That was fast. Too fast, Sarah murmured. He must know something. Daisy let out a small whimper, shifting her weight slightly as if she sensed the tension in the room. Dr. Carter reached out, running a calming hand over her back. We're going to keep you safe, he promised. No one's ever going to hurt you again. 15 minutes later, the sound of a police car pulling up outside sent a wave of silence through the clinic. Dr. Carter stepped outside, watching as Officer Reynolds climbed out of his vehicle. The officer's face was unreadable, but there was something in his posture that put Dr. Carter on edge. I need to see the mark, Reynolds said without preamble. Dr. Carter led him inside, back to the kennel where Daisy lay. The officer knelt beside the dog, studying the faint brand closely. His jaw tightened as he pulled out his phone, scrolling through something before holding up an image side by side with Daisy's paw. A perfect match. Sarah peered over his shoulder, her eyes widening. That's the same mark. Reynolds nodded grimly. I've seen this before. Dr. Carter felt a chill creep up his spine. Where? The officer exhaled, running a hand over his face. There's been a rise in underground breeding operations, not just backyard breeders. These are people running illegal kennels, treating dogs like property, forcing them to breed over and over again. Some of the worst cases involve fighting rings, where they brand dogs to mark them as part of their operation. Sarah covered her mouth, horror flashing in her eyes. You think she came from something like that? Reynolds nodded. I do. And if she escaped, there's a good chance someone's looking for her. Dr. Carter's grip on the kennel door tightened. We can't let her go back to that. We won't, Reynolds assured him. But we need to be careful. If she belonged to one of these rings, the people running it aren't going to just let it go. They may try to take her back. Mrs. Porter crossed her arms. Then we need to move her somewhere safe. Reynolds nodded. I'll make some calls, see if we can place her in protective custody with a foster who specializes in cases like this. Dr. Carter's stomach twisted at the thought of Daisy being taken away just as she was beginning to trust them. But he knew the officer was right. If there was even a chance someone was looking for her, keeping her in one place wasn't safe. Sarah knelt beside Daisy, gently stroking her fur. She deserves a second chance, she whispered. She deserves love, not fear. Reynolds stood, his expression determined. Then let's make sure she gets it. As he stepped outside to make his calls, Dr. Carter looked down at Daisy once more. She had been through so much, but she was still here, still fighting, and he wasn't going to let her down. Dr. Carter paced the length of the clinic's back room, his mind racing with every possibility. Daisy lay in her kennel, her breathing slow and steady, but he could still see the tension in the way she curled her paws beneath her body. Even in her sleep, she was guarding herself. He clenched his fists, anger simmering just beneath the surface. The thought of anyone hurting an animal, especially a dog as gentle as Daisy, filled him with a frustration he couldn't quite put into words. Sarah sat on a stool nearby, tapping at her phone. "Officer Reynolds is checking into foster placements, but he says it could take a few days," she murmured. "Apparently, cases like this aren't easy to place." Dr. Carter frowned. "I don't like waiting. If someone is looking for her, every day we delay is another day they could find her." Mrs. Porter had returned to the shelter to handle other cases, but before she left, she had reassured them that they'd figure something out. Still, the weight of the situation sat heavy in the air. The clinic was quiet, except for the occasional hum of medical equipment. Dr. Carter glanced at Daisy again. She was starting to eat a little more, moving slightly more freely, but the real test would come when she felt safe enough to show her paws. He wasn't going to rush her. He had seen dogs recover from all kinds of trauma, and each one did it in their own time. But this was different. This wasn't just about healing. This was about keeping her alive. A knock at the front door startled him from his thoughts. Sarah jumped up to answer it, but Dr. Carter's gut twisted. "Wait," he said, stepping forward. "We aren't expecting anyone." Sarah hesitated, but nodded. She checked the security camera feed on her phone, then frowned. "It's just some guy. He looks nervous." Dr. Carter moved beside her to get a look. A man in his early 30s stood outside, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. He wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face and a heavy jacket, despite the mild weather. Something about him felt off. "Let me handle this," Dr. Carter said, unlocking the door but keeping his body between the man and the entrance. "Can I help you?" The man shifted uncomfortably. Yeah, I was wondering if you had found a dog, a golden retriever." Dr. Carter's heart pounded in his chest. He kept his expression neutral. "We have several dogs in our care. Do you have a missing pet?" The man swallowed hard. "Yeah, female, golden, kinda small." Sarah tensed beside him, her fingers tightening on the doorframe. Dr. Carter folded his arms. "Do you have any photos? Vet records? Something to prove she's yours?" The man hesitated. "Not exactly. She's not really mine, but I was watching her for someone and she got loose." Dr. Carter felt ice crawl down his spine. "Who were you watching her for?" The man rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, I just need to know if you have her." Dr. Carter didn't move. "If you don't have proof of ownership, I can't help you." The man's jaw tightened. For a second, his eyes darted toward the clinic's windows. "I just need to know if she's here." Dr. Carter took a slow step forward, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I think you should leave." The man clenched his fists but didn't argue. Instead, he let out a breath and took a step back. "Fine. But if you hear anything, let me know." Dr. Carter didn't answer. He shut the door and locked it. When he turned back, Sarah's face was pale. "That was them, wasn't it?" she whispered. Dr. Carter nodded. "It wasn't just some guy looking for his lost dog. He was sent." Sarah swallowed. "Then we don't have a few days. We need to move her now." Dr. Carter grabbed his phone and dialed Officer Reynolds. "We have a problem," he said the moment the officer picked up. "Someone just came looking for her." Reynolds swore under his breath. "Describe him." Dr. Carter relayed the details. and Reynolds sighed. Sounds like a scout. They send guys like that to poke around before they make a move. Dr. Carter's stomach churned. Then they know she's here. They suspect, Reynolds corrected. But that's bad enough. Pack a bag for her. I'm coming to get her. Sarah blinked. Where are we taking her? There's a woman who runs a sanctuary out in the country. She specializes in trauma cases and witness protection for animals tied to abuse cases. If anyone can keep Daisy safe, it's her. Dr. Carter exhaled, looking at Daisy once more. She won't understand why we're moving her. She will, Sarah said softly. She knows she's in danger. Daisy lifted her head slightly as if sensing their urgency. Dr. Carter bent down, gently stroking her ears. Come on, sweetheart, he murmured. It's time to go. Sarah packed some food and supplies, while Dr. Carter carefully lifted Daisy into a transport crate. She didn't resist, but he felt the slight tremor in her body. She was scared. So was he. They waited in silence until the sound of tires crunching on gravel signaled Reynolds' arrival. He stepped out of his vehicle quickly, scanning the area before motioning for them to move. Let's go. Now. Dr. Carter carried the crate, keeping his grip steady even as his heart pounded. He had no idea if someone was watching, if someone was waiting. But he knew one thing for certain. Daisy wasn't going back to the life she had escaped. Not now. Not ever. Dr. Carter sat in the passenger seat of Officer Reynolds' SUV, watching the dark road stretch ahead. Daisy's crate was in the back, secured in place, and Sarah sat beside it, murmuring softly to keep her calm. The tension in the air was thick, but no one spoke about it. They all knew the stakes. Reynolds drove with purpose, checking his rearview mirror every few minutes. The country roads were empty, but that didn't mean they weren't being followed. Dr. Carter didn't want to think about what would happen if the wrong people caught up to them before they reached their destination. How much farther? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. About 40 more minutes, Reynolds answered. The sanctuary's off-grid. No one will find her there. Dr. Carter exhaled slowly, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He still couldn't wrap his head around it all. A simple shelter case had turned into something much bigger, something dangerous. Daisy wasn't just another stray. She was evidence. And evidence was something people were willing to destroy. Daisy let out a small whimper from the back, shifting inside her crate. Sarah reached a hand through the bars, offering her touch as a reassurance. You're okay, sweet girl, she murmured. We've got you. Reynolds took another sharp turn, slowing down as they approached a narrow dirt road lined with thick trees. Dr. Carter peered ahead, barely able to make out the outline of a fence and a large wooden gate at the end of the path. This is it, Reynolds said, reaching for his phone. He tapped out a quick message, then rolled down his window as the gate slowly creaked open. Dr. Carter leaned forward, trying to make out the figure standing in the darkness just beyond the fence. As they pulled in, the headlights illuminated a woman, tall, strong-looking, with a calm but serious expression. She stepped forward, waving them inside. Reynolds parked and turned off the engine. Stay here, he instructed, before stepping out to meet the woman. Dr. Carter watched as they spoke in hushed tones. The woman nodded, then motioned for them to follow her toward a large barn-like structure near the back of the property. A soft light glowed from inside, casting a warm contrast to the cool night air. Come on, Sarah said, carefully lifting the crate. Daisy let out a soft noise of protest, but didn't resist. Dr. Carter grabbed the supplies, then followed her toward the building. The moment they stepped inside, the warmth wrapped around them like a protective blanket. The space was clean, quiet, and filled with the faint scent of hay and cedar. "This is Rebecca," Reynolds said, motioning toward the woman. "She runs the sanctuary." Rebecca nodded in greeting, her gaze sharp as she studied Daisy. "Poor girl," she murmured, stepping closer. "She's been through a lot." Dr. Carter set the supplies down. "She has. We found a brand on her paw." Rebecca's eyes darkened. "I've seen it before. Dogs that come from those places, they don't escape unless they're desperate." Sarah knelt beside the crate, opening the door slowly. "Daisy, sweetheart, you're safe here," she whispered. Daisy hesitated, her body tense. Then, slowly, cautiously, she took a shaky step out. Her paws barely touched the soft bedding before she froze again, her eyes darting around the room as if waiting for something bad to happen. Rebecca crouched down, keeping her movements slow. "She doesn't trust the ground yet," she observed. "They keep them in cages. Most of them don't know what it feels like to walk freely." Dr. Carter swallowed hard. He had known it was bad, but hearing it said out loud made it worse. Rebecca reached for a small bowl of water, placing it near Daisy without forcing it on her. "She'll adjust," she said softly. "She just needs time." Sarah wiped at her eyes, nodding. "She deserves it." Reynolds stepped forward. "No one can know she's here. Not yet. The people who did this, they don't let things go easily." Rebecca's expression hardened. "I know how to keep a dog hidden." Dr. Carter exhaled, feeling a weight lift off his chest for the first time that night. "Then she's in the right place." Daisy took another hesitant step forward, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. Then, in a movement so small it was almost imperceptible, she relaxed. Just a little. And for the first time, Dr. Carter allowed himself to hope. Rebecca turned to them. "You all should get some rest. She'll be okay here." Dr. Carter hesitated, watching Daisy. "I don't want to just leave her." Rebecca smiled gently. "You've done your part getting her here. Now, let me do mine." Sarah nodded, but she looked just as reluctant as Dr. Carter felt. "Will you let us know how she does?" "Of course," Rebecca assured them. "I'll keep you updated on her progress." Reynolds checked his watch. "We should go. The longer we stay, the more we risk leading someone here." Dr. Carter glanced at Daisy one last time, before finally nodding. "All right." As they stepped outside, the night was eerily quiet. Reynolds led them back to the SUV, but before he got in, he looked around the property. "If they're looking for her, they'll check every shelter, every vet clinic in the area. They won't stop until they think they've exhausted all leads." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself. "You think they'll give up?" Reynolds shook his head. "Not if she's as valuable to them as I think she is." Dr. Carter frowned. "What do you mean?" Reynolds hesitated. "Some of these operations, if they invest a lot into a dog, they don't just let them go. Some are trained for fighting, some for breeding. If she escaped, she might have been considered property to someone dangerous." The thought made Dr. Carter's stomach turn. He had already suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made it worse. "Then we need to be ready," he said. "If they come looking, we need to make sure they find nothing." Reynolds nodded. "Agreed." As they drove away from the sanctuary, Dr. Carter stared out the window, lost in thought. He had helped animals his whole life, but this was different. This was a fight against something bigger than he had ever faced, and he wasn't about to back down. Dr. Carter had barely slept by the time he arrived back at the clinic the next morning. The events of the previous night kept replaying in his mind. Daisy was safe for now, but for how long? He could still see the way she hesitated before stepping out of the crate, the fear deeply rooted in her bones. That kind of fear didn't go away overnight. It lingered, shaping the way a dog moved, the way they reacted to the world. And Daisy had every reason to be afraid. Sarah walked in a few minutes later, looking just as exhausted as he felt. "I called Rebecca this morning," she said, rubbing her arms. "Daisy ate a little bit. She hasn't moved around much, but Rebecca says that's normal. She's letting her settle in at her own pace." Dr. Carter nodded. "That's good. She needs time." Sarah hesitated, then leaned against the counter. "Do you really think they'll come looking for her?" He didn't answer right away. His gut told him they would. People who saw animals as property didn't just let them go. If they had invested in Daisy, whether for breeding or something worse, she wasn't just a dog to them. She was a commodity. And commodities didn't just disappear without consequence. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "But we need to be ready in case they do." Sarah exhaled and nodded. "Officer Reynolds said he's running background checks in the area. He thinks the man who came to the clinic was just the first step." Dr. Carter's jaw clenched. "If they come back, we won't give them anything." The door chime rang, making them both stiffen instinctively. Sarah turned, but it was only Mrs. Porter, her expression lined with worry. "I just got off the phone with Reynolds," she said, shutting the door behind her. "He says there's been some unusual activity near the shelter." Dr. Carter's chest tightened. "What kind of activity?" Mrs. Porter shook her head. "Cars circling late at night. People asking strange questions. He doesn't think they know where Daisy is, but they're looking." Sarah swallowed. "What do we do?" Dr. Carter took a slow breath, forcing himself to think clearly. "We stay alert. If they're looking for her, they'll assume she's still in the area. We make sure no one at the shelter talks to strangers about any new dogs, and we don't let our guard down." Mrs. Porter nodded. "Reynolds said he'd increase patrols around the clinic and the shelter. If anything seems off, we call him immediately." Sarah's arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes worried. "Do you think Rebecca's sanctuary is safe enough?" Dr. Carter wanted to say yes, but the truth was he didn't know. "It's far enough off the grid that it'll take time for anyone to track her there, but we have to be prepared for the worst." The room fell into silence, the weight of the situation settling heavily between them. Finally, Mrs. Porter straightened. "I'm going to head back to the shelter. I'll check in if I hear anything new." As she left, Dr. Carter glanced at Sarah. "We'll get through this." Sarah forced a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I hope so." That night, Dr. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He stayed at the clinic late, making rounds, double-checking the locks, ensuring everything was secure. The night was still, but his nerves wouldn't settle. Just as he was about to head home, his phone buzzed. A text from Reynolds. "Someone broke into a property near the sanctuary. No one was hurt, but we need to be careful." Dr. Carter's grip tightened around the phone. It wasn't a coincidence. They were getting closer. He quickly dialed Rebecca's number, his heart pounding as it rang. She picked up on the second ring. "She's safe," she said immediately, as if she knew why he was calling. "But something's not right. I heard something outside last night. It could have been an animal, but I don't think it was." Dr. Carter closed his eyes for a brief moment. "Reynolds is looking into it. Keep her inside. Don't let her out of your sight." Rebecca's voice was calm but firm. "I won't." Dr. Carter exhaled slowly. "We need to be ready. This isn't over yet." The next morning, as Dr. Carter pulled up to the clinic, his phone rang again. It was Reynolds. "I need you at the station," Reynolds said without preamble. "We got some footage from a traffic camera. You need to see this." Dr. Carter didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way." He told Sarah where he was going and drove straight to the police station, his mind spinning with possibilities. When he arrived, Reynolds was waiting for him in a dimly lit office, a monitor glowing on the desk. "This was taken last night near Rebecca's property," Reynolds said, clicking play on the video. Dr. Carter leaned in, watching as a dark SUV crept along the road near the sanctuary. The vehicle paused for a moment, then its headlights flicked off. Seconds later, a figure stepped out. Dr. Carter's breath caught. He recognized that build. That stance. It was the man from the clinic. Reynolds let the video loop again. "They're getting closer, and they're not giving up." Dr. Carter clenched his fists. "Then neither are we." Dr. Carter sat back in the chair, his mind racing. The man from the clinic, the one who had come asking about Daisy, was now near the sanctuary. That meant they were getting closer to finding her, and that meant they were running out of time. Reynolds studied the monitor for a moment longer before rubbing his face. "We don't have enough for an arrest yet, but this proves one thing. They haven't given up. We need to assume they're watching every shelter, clinic, and rescue in the area." Dr. Carter exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. "We need to move her again. Rebecca's place isn't safe anymore." Reynolds shook his head. "It's not that simple. We don't have a better place yet. We need to think this through." Sarah, who had just arrived at the station after hearing the news, crossed her arms. "Then what do we do? Wait until they make a move? We can't risk them finding her." Reynolds tapped his fingers against the desk, deep in thought. "We need to throw them off. Make them think she's somewhere else." Dr. Carter frowned. "How?" Reynolds pulled up a map on the computer screen. "We put out a false lead. We have contacts at other rescues. We let it slip that we took in a golden retriever matching Daisy's description, but we send them in the wrong direction. If they take the bait, it buys us time." Sarah's eyebrows furrowed. "And if they don't?" Reynolds sighed. "Then we regroup and figure out another plan. But right now, they're closing in. We need to be ahead of them." Dr. Carter ran a hand through his hair. "Fine. But while we do that, we need to find a safer place for her. I won't risk her getting hurt." Reynolds nodded. "I'll make some calls. But in the meantime, keep everything as normal as possible. No sudden movements, no changes in routine. If they think we're onto them, they'll get desperate." Dr. Carter clenched his fists. He hated feeling like they were always reacting instead of taking control. But he also knew they had to be careful. "I'll call Rebecca. She needs to know what's happening." Sarah exhaled sharply. "Let's hope we're one step ahead." Back at the clinic, Dr. Carter dialed Rebecca's number. She picked up almost immediately. "Tell me you have good news." Dr. Carter hesitated. "Not exactly. The man from the clinic was spotted near your property. We think they're getting closer." Rebecca swore under her breath. "So what do we do?" "Reynolds is going to put out a false lead, send them looking in the wrong place. But we need to be ready in case that doesn't work. How's Daisy doing?" Rebecca sighed. "She's scared. She barely leaves the back of the barn. But she's eating. That's something." Dr. Carter felt a small bit of relief. "Good. Keep her safe. We're working on a new plan." "She won't be alone," Rebecca said firmly. "I promise you that." Dr. Carter hung up, staring out the clinic window. He knew Rebecca would protect Daisy with everything she had, but he also knew they couldn't keep running forever. Eventually, they'd have to put an end to this. The next morning, Reynolds put their plan into action. Word spread through the local rescue network that a golden retriever fitting Daisy's description had been transported to a shelter 2 towns over. It didn't take long for movement to follow. By that afternoon, Reynolds called with an update. They took the bait. The same SUV was seen outside the shelter we planted the lead at. They're following the wrong trail. Dr. Carter allowed himself to breathe for the first time in hours. That gives us some time. Not much, Reynolds warned. Eventually they'll figure it out. We need to be ready when they do. Dr. Carter nodded. Then we use this time wisely. Sarah walked in, her eyes filled with determination. What's next? Dr. Carter met her gaze. We fight back, but we do it smart. Daisy wasn't just a dog anymore. She was a symbol of something bigger, and he wasn't about to let her down. Hours later, as Dr. Carter sat in his office, a new thought struck him. What if we could link them to other cases? If they're running a full operation, there have to be more dogs, more evidence. Sarah, sitting across from him, perked up. You mean instead of just protecting Daisy, we go after them? Exactly, Dr. Carter said. Reynolds can't do much without solid proof. But if we can find out where they keep the dogs, if we can show they've been doing this to more animals, then we have a real case. Sarah nodded slowly. So how do we find them? Dr. Carter exhaled. We start with the brand on Daisy's paw. That mark means something. If we can trace it, we might find out who's behind this. Sarah grabbed her phone. I'll do some digging. Maybe there's a registry or something. If they've been using that symbol for a while, someone must have noticed. Dr. Carter nodded. Good. And I'll talk to Reynolds. If we can give him enough to work with, maybe we can end this before they find her. As Sarah scrolled through different searches, her expression suddenly changed. Wait a second, I think I found something. Dr. Carter leaned over as she turned the screen toward him. It was a blurry image, but the symbol looked the same. It's from an old case, 3 years ago, Sarah murmured. A raid on an illegal breeder's compound in Texas. They were branding their dogs the same way. Dr. Carter's stomach tightened. If it's the same people, they've been doing this for years. And if they got away with it before, they won't stop now. Sarah swallowed hard. Then we need to stop them first. Dr. Carter picked up his phone. It was time to call Reynolds again. This wasn't just about Daisy anymore. It never had been. It was about justice for every animal these people had ever hurt. Dr. Carter didn't waste a second. He pressed the call button for Reynolds and waited as the line rang. When the officer answered, his voice was tight. Tell me you have something. We do, Dr. Carter said, his heart pounding. Sarah found a case from 3 years ago in Texas. Dogs branded with the same mark as Daisy. It was linked to an illegal breeding operation. If it's the same people, then this isn't just one case. It's a network. Reynolds swore under his breath. That explains why they're so desperate to get her back. If we can connect them to past operations, we might have enough to bring them down. What's our next move? Dr. Carter asked. I need confirmation, Reynolds said. Send me everything Sarah found. I'll run it through our system and see if there are any open investigations still tied to it. If we can prove they're still active, we'll have more than enough to go after them. Sarah was already forwarding files as she spoke. I just sent everything over. Check your inbox. Reynolds hummed in acknowledgement. Got it. I'll call some contacts in Texas. In the meantime, stay put. Keep everything normal. If they realize we're on to them, they'll disappear. Dr. Carter hated the thought of waiting, but he knew Reynolds was right. Keep us updated. Will do. Reynolds hung up. Sarah exhaled, leaning back in her chair. This is big, James. If we can link them, we might actually stop them. Dr. Carter nodded, glancing at the clock. Every second counted. But for now, all they could do was wait. The next 24 hours were tense. Reynolds was working behind the scenes, but it was hard not knowing what was happening. Dr. Carter focused on his work at the clinic, keeping up with his usual routine. But his mind was elsewhere. He checked in with Rebecca twice. Daisy was doing better, slowly becoming more comfortable in her temporary home. But they both knew she couldn't stay there forever. The following evening, Reynolds finally called back. "We got them." Dr. Carter nearly dropped his phone. "What?" "The Texas authorities confirmed it. The branding matches a group they've been investigating for years. They move from state to state, setting up illegal breeding operations and dogfighting rings. They're careful, but they made a mistake. We have enough to open a formal case here. And Daisy might be the key witness we need." Dr. Carter felt a surge of both relief and anger. "So what now?" "Now," Reynolds said, "we build a case strong enough to take them down for good, but we need to move fast. If they realize we're closing in, they'll disappear. And if they find Daisy first." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Dr. Carter straightened. "Tell us what to do. We're ready." Reynolds hesitated. "We need more than just Daisy. We need another lead. Something that proves this group is still operating in our area. I have a couple of ideas, but they're risky." Sarah, who had been listening, leaned forward. "Risky how?" Reynolds sighed. "We might need to bait them out, see if they try to reclaim another dog, follow the movement of their people, get enough evidence to get a warrant. We need something solid." Dr. Carter frowned. "We can't put another dog in danger." "I know," Reynolds said. "That's why we do this carefully. But there's a way we can use Daisy's disappearance against them. If they think someone else has taken a dog from their operation, they might get desperate and expose themselves." Sarah's eyes widened. "You want to make them think she was stolen?" "Exactly," Reynolds confirmed. "If we circulate a fake rumor that Daisy wasn't just lost, but intentionally taken, they might slip up trying to get her back. They're careful, but not perfect." Dr. Carter exhaled. "It's dangerous." "So is doing nothing," Reynolds said. "Look, I'm not asking you to put anyone at risk. But if we can get them to make a mistake, we might be able to shut them down for good." Sarah exchanged a glance with Dr. Carter. He could see the uncertainty in her eyes, but also the same fire he felt in his own chest. They had come too far to walk away now. "All right," Dr. Carter finally said. "How do we do it?" Reynolds laid out the plan. Over the next few days, they would strategically leak the idea that Daisy had been taken from the people who had been using her. They would plant the information in online rescue groups, knowing the organization had eyes everywhere. They would act like someone within the illegal operation had turned against them. "They'll try to find out who did it," Reynolds explained, "and in doing that, they'll show us who they really are." Dr. Carter wasn't sure if the plan would work, but they had to try. 3 days later, the first signs of movement appeared. An anonymous online account began asking questions in rescue forums. They were looking for a specific golden retriever, offering a vague but suspiciously large reward. A few of Reynolds' undercover contacts began tracing the posts. Then, late one night, Reynolds called Dr. Carter again. "We have something. Someone connected to them is looking for information on local vet clinics that treat strays. They're searching for leads, trying to narrow down where she might be." Dr. Carter's stomach twisted. "That means they're still looking." "Yes," Reynolds confirmed. "But that also means they're worried. That's exactly what we wanted. If they feel pressure, they'll make mistakes." "What do we do now?" Sarah asked. standing next to Dr. Carter. "We wait just a little longer," Reynolds said. "We let them sweat, and when they make their next move, we'll be ready." Dr. Carter wasn't sure how much longer they could keep this up, but he knew one thing. Daisy wasn't going back. Not now. Not ever. Dr. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a fine line between control and chaos. The trap was set, and now they had to wait for the criminals to take the bait. But waiting was the hardest part. He knew Reynolds was right. They had to let these people make a mistake before they could strike. But the idea of just sitting back while Daisy remained in danger gnawed at him. Sarah sat across from him in the clinic's break room, scrolling through online rescue groups and keeping an eye on any suspicious activity. "They're still posting about a missing golden retriever," she murmured. "They're getting desperate. The reward just went up." Dr. Carter frowned. "That means they're willing to take more risks." Sarah nodded. "And that could be our opening." Just then, his phone buzzed. Reynolds. "Something's happening," the officer said without preamble. "One of my contacts just picked up chatter that they think they've found a lead on Daisy's location." Dr. Carter's pulse quickened. "Where?" "A boarding kennel just outside of town," Reynolds said. "They don't know for sure, but they're planning to check it out tonight. If they think she's there, they might try to grab her." Sarah's eyes widened as she listened in. "What do we do?" Reynolds' voice was firm. "We let them walk into their own trap. I've already got a team on standby. We'll be watching. If they break in, that's enough for us to move in." Dr. Carter exhaled. "And if they realize it's not Daisy?" "Then we hope they panic and slip up," Reynolds said. "Either way, this could be the break we need." Sarah bit her lip. "I just hope it's enough." Hours passed with agonizing slowness. When night fell, Dr. Carter and Sarah sat together in the clinic, waiting for an update. Every few minutes, Sarah checked her phone, scrolling through forums, looking for any sign that their target had figured out the truth. Then, just after midnight, Reynolds called again. "They took the bait," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. "3 of them broke into the boarding kennel. We got them in the act." Dr. Carter felt a rush of adrenaline. "And?" "They're in custody," Reynolds confirmed. "And they're talking." Sarah's grip on her phone tightened. "Are they giving up the rest of the operation?" "Not yet," Reynolds admitted. "But one of them was carrying a burner phone, and our tech team is working on pulling the data now. If there are any texts, calls, or GPS locations that connect them to a larger network, we'll have what we need." Dr. Carter ran a hand through his hair. "And what about Daisy? Are they still looking for her?" "That's the bad news," Reynolds said. "They're not the top guys, just foot soldiers. But they confirmed what we suspected. There's someone higher up running this, and they're the ones who want her back." Sarah's face went pale. "So this isn't over?" Reynolds sighed. "Not yet. But it's a start. And if that phone gives us what we need, we might be able to end this before they get any closer." Dr. Carter nodded. "Then we need to be ready, because if they realize we're closing in, they'll come faster." And that was something they couldn't afford. The next morning, Reynolds showed up at the clinic, dark circles under his eyes but a determined expression on his face. He placed his phone on the counter and pulled up a list of messages recovered from the burner phone. "We got something. The messages confirm that Daisy was part of a larger operation. They don't say exactly where the main site is, but there's mention of another shipment of dogs arriving soon." Dr. Carter stiffened. "Shipment? As in more dogs like Daisy?" Reynolds nodded grimly. "Yeah, and if we can intercept it, we'll have enough evidence to take them down. But we need to act fast. The drop-off is happening tomorrow night." Sarah leaned forward. "Where?" Reynolds hesitated. "An abandoned warehouse on the east side of town. We're setting up surveillance now, but we need to be careful. If they suspect anything, they'll bolt. Dr. Carter felt a deep anger settle in his chest. So what's the plan? Reynolds exhaled. We go in quietly. We watch. The moment we confirm they have the dogs, we move in. But we need you and Sarah to stay out of it. This could get dangerous. Sarah crossed her arms. Daisy is the reason we're here. We're not backing down now. Dr. Carter nodded. We won't interfere, but we need to be there. We need to know those dogs are safe. Reynolds looked between them and sighed. Fine, but you stay back and let us handle it. The next night, the tension was palpable as they waited outside the warehouse. Dr. Carter and Sarah sat in an unmarked police car, watching through binoculars as several men moved inside the building. A van was parked out front, and from the way they were acting, it was clear something was happening. Reynolds' voice crackled over the radio. We have confirmation. The dogs are inside. Stand by. Dr. Carter's heart pounded. How many? At least a dozen, Reynolds responded. We're going in now. The moment he said it, chaos erupted. Officers swarmed the warehouse, shouts rang out, and within seconds the men inside tried to scatter. But the police were ready. Within minutes they had the suspects on the ground, handcuffed and restrained. Sarah grabbed Dr. Carter's arm. Look! From the back of the van, officers were carefully guiding out cages filled with frightened, malnourished dogs. Some whimpered, others barked in confusion, but all of them had the same haunted look that Daisy had when she first arrived at the clinic. Dr. Carter felt a lump in his throat. We did it. Sarah wiped at her eyes. They're safe. Reynolds approached the car a few minutes later, his expression victorious. We got them, and we found more phones. This is over. We have enough evidence to put them away for good. Dr. Carter let out a shaky breath. And the dogs? We're taking them to a safe shelter now, Reynolds assured him. Including Daisy. She can finally be free. Dr. Carter closed his eyes for a brief moment, overwhelmed with relief. They had done it. Daisy wasn't just safe. She was the key to saving so many others. And for the first time since this ordeal started, he allowed himself to believe that everything would be all right. Dr. Carter sat in his office the next morning, the weight of everything that had happened settling in. It wasn't over yet, not completely. The criminals had been arrested, the dogs had been rescued, and the operation had been dismantled. But something inside him couldn't relax. Not yet. Sarah walked in, holding a steaming cup of coffee. She set it down on his desk and sat across from him. You look like you haven't slept. Dr. Carter ran a hand over his face. I haven't. I keep thinking about the ones we didn't save. If they've been doing this for years, how many dogs were lost before Daisy? Sarah sighed. We can't change the past, but we saved the ones we could. And Daisy, she's finally free. A small smile tugged at his lips. Yeah, she is. As if on cue, his phone buzzed. It was Rebecca. Good news, she said as soon as he answered. Daisy's doing great. She's been more active this morning. She actually wagged her tail at me. Dr. Carter chuckled. That's a miracle. She's starting to trust again, Rebecca said. And it's because of you. Dr. Carter leaned back in his chair. It wasn't just me. Sarah, Reynolds, you, we all had a part in this. Rebecca laughed. Well, whatever we did, it worked. She's even started playing with one of the other rescues. She's finally acting like a dog again. Dr. Carter felt his chest tighten in the best way possible. That's all I ever wanted. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to breathe. They weren't done fighting for animals like Daisy, but for now, she was safe. And that was enough. Sarah smiled at him as he ended the call. See, it was worth it. Dr. Carter nodded. Yeah, it really was. But even as he let himself feel relief, there was still work to be done. He stood up, stretching, and grabbed his jacket. Come on, let's go check on the dogs at the shelter. Sarah grinned. Back to work already? Always, Dr. Carter said. They drove to the shelter in comfortable silence, both of them lost in their thoughts. When they arrived, Mrs. Porter was waiting outside, arms crossed but a warm smile on her face. You two look like you could use some rest. Dr. Carter chuckled. We'll rest when we know all these dogs are okay. Sarah nodded in agreement. How are they? Mrs. Porter led them inside. Scared, but safe. Some of them have been through worse than Daisy. It's going to take time. Dr. Carter knelt beside a kennel where a small, trembling Labrador mix sat curled in the corner. His heart ached at the sight. We'll help them through it. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a soft treat. He held it out patiently, letting the dog sniff it at his own pace. After a few minutes, the pup tentatively licked the treat, then took it from his palm. Sarah smiled. Looks like you made a new friend. Dr. Carter gently stroked the pup's head. It's a start. They spent the rest of the day tending to the rescued dogs, helping them adjust, making sure they knew they were safe. Each one had a story, a past filled with fear and pain. But now, they had a future. As the sun began to set, Dr. Carter stepped outside to get some air. He leaned against the railing, watching as the sky turned shades of orange and pink. Sarah joined him a few moments later. You're thinking about what's next, she said knowingly. Dr. Carter nodded. There's always another case. Another dog that needs saving. Sarah nudged him playfully. That's why we do this, right? He smiled. Yeah, that's why we do this. As he stood there, the weight of the past few weeks finally starting to lift, he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. Because as long as there were animals like Daisy out there, he had a job to do. And he would never let them down. Later that evening, Dr. Carter sat in his office, reviewing medical reports for the rescued dogs. Some were underweight, others had old injuries that hadn't healed properly, and a few showed signs of extreme neglect. It was heartbreaking, but it was also a reminder of why they did what they did. Sarah poked her head into the office. Reynolds just called. He said the case is officially moving forward. The people responsible won't be getting out anytime soon. Dr. Carter exhaled, relief washing over him. That's the best news I've heard all day. She stepped inside and sat across from him. What happens next? He leaned back in his chair. We keep going. We keep fighting for every dog that needs us, and we make sure this never happens again. Sarah smiled. I think Daisy would be proud. Dr. Carter chuckled. I think she'd just be happy to have a warm bed and a full belly. Sarah laughed. Yeah, that too. For the first time in a long time, the future felt hopeful. There were still battles to fight, still animals in need of saving. But tonight, they had won. And that was enough to keep going. Dr. Carter woke early the next morning, his mind already running through the long list of tasks ahead. The fight wasn't over. It never really would be. But today, there was progress, and that was something. At the clinic, Sarah was already there, sorting through files and making calls to potential adopters. We've had a lot of people reaching out about the rescues, she said as soon as he walked in. Especially after the news story ran last night. Dr. Carter grabbed a cup of coffee and took a seat across from her. That's good. People need to know what happened. It might stop something like this from happening again. Sarah nodded. Some of the dogs are already being placed in foster homes. The ones that need more rehabilitation will stay with us a bit longer. Dr. Carter leaned back. And Daisy? Sarah smiled. Rebecca says she's improving every day. She actually went outside on her own this morning. No coaxing, no fear. Dr. Carter felt something loosen in his chest. She's finally free. Before Sarah could respond, the door chimed. Mrs. Porter walked in, holding a folder of documents. We've got another problem, she said, placing the folder down. There's been talk of another operation. Dr. Carter's stomach dropped. Already? Mrs. Porter nodded grimly. Reynolds called me this morning. Some of the men they arrested aren't talking, which means there could be more out there. And worse? We might have only scratched the surface. Sarah exhaled. I was hoping for at least one quiet day. Dr. Carter flipped through the documents, his mind already shifting into action. We don't stop, he murmured. We find them before they hurt more dogs. Mrs. Porter nodded. Reynolds is digging for more leads. We'll know soon enough. Sarah looked at Dr. Carter, determination burning in her eyes. Then we do what we do best. Dr. Carter set the folder down and stood. Let's get to work. As long as there were dogs in need, they would keep going, because saving one life had led to saving dozens, and they weren't done yet. A few hours later, Reynolds arrived at the clinic, his expression serious. He carried a thick envelope under his arm and gestured for Dr. Carter and Sarah to follow him into the back room. All right, Reynolds started, dropping the envelope onto the table. This just came in from one of my contacts. We've got names, locations, and possible connections to other operations. The people we arrested aren't talking, but we've got a new lead. Dr. Carter exchanged a glance with Sarah before opening the envelope. Inside were grainy surveillance photos, maps, and a list of names. His stomach tightened as he flipped through them. This is bigger than we thought. Reynolds nodded. Much bigger. The group we took down wasn't the head of the snake. It was just one piece of a larger network. From what we can tell, they're running operations in multiple states. Texas was just one of them. And now we've found links to more in the Midwest. Sarah leaned in. So what's the next step? Reynolds exhaled. We keep digging. We follow the money, the supply chains, and the people involved. But there's more. We think there's another shipment of dogs coming in within the next 2 weeks. Dr. Carter felt a rush of anger. Another one? Even after the last bust? Reynolds nodded grimly. These guys don't stop. They just adapt. But this time, we'll be waiting for them. Sarah crossed her arms. What do you need from us? Reynolds hesitated. We need someone who understands how these dogs are treated, what to look for in medical records, and how to identify victims of abuse. Carter, that's you. We're going to need your expertise. Dr. Carter didn't hesitate. I'm in. Sarah cleared her throat. I'm in too. Reynolds gave them both a warning look. This is dangerous. We're talking about people who won't hesitate to cover their tracks. Dr. Carter met his gaze evenly. We know. But if there's a chance to save more dogs, we have to take it. Reynolds sighed. All right, we'll meet tomorrow night to go over the details. For now, keep things quiet. After Reynolds left, Sarah sat back, exhaling. I can't believe this is happening again. Dr. Carter looked down at the photos spread across the table. We started something, Sarah. Now we finish it. The next night, Dr. Carter met with Reynolds and his team in a secure location outside of town. The warehouse bust had given them enough credibility to bring in more law enforcement support. This time, they weren't just reacting, they were planning ahead. Reynolds pointed to a map. The next shipment is supposed to come through here, at an old trucking yard just outside city limits. We don't know the exact number of dogs, but we estimate at least 20. Dr. Carter clenched his jaw. 20 lives. We can't lose them. Reynolds nodded. Which is why we have to be careful. We're setting up a sting operation. This time, we take down the people at the top. Sarah studied the layout. How do we make sure none of the dogs get caught in the crossfire? Reynolds pointed at an adjacent building. We have officers stationed here. The moment we confirm the dogs are on site, we move in. Our goal is to secure the animals first, and then take down the suspects. Dr. Carter felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. And if something goes wrong? Reynolds met his gaze. Then we adapt. But we don't let these dogs disappear. Dr. Carter nodded. We're ready. The night of the sting was tense. The team was in position, hidden in the shadows as they watched the suspects move in. A large truck pulled into the yard, its engine humming in the darkness. Dr. Carter sat in one of the surveillance vehicles, heart pounding. Through his binoculars, he could see figures moving near the truck. Then he saw them. Cages stacked in the back, filled with frightened dogs. Reynolds' voice came through the earpiece. Hold, we wait for confirmation. Minutes dragged on like hours. Then, a voice crackled over the radio. Confirmed, we have the dogs. Move in. Chaos erupted. Officers stormed the yard, lights flashing, voices shouting. Dr. Carter jumped out of the van and ran toward the truck, his eyes locked on the cages. The dogs were terrified, some whining, others cowering in the corners of their enclosures. Sarah was right behind him. We need bolt cutters, she shouted. One of the officers tossed a set over, and Dr. Carter quickly went to work, snapping the locks open. As soon as the doors swung wide, the dogs hesitated. Then, one by one, they realized they were safe. Sarah knelt down, coaxing a trembling border collie out of its cage. It's okay, you're free now. Dr. Carter felt something wet against his hand and looked down to see a golden retriever staring up at him with wide, uncertain eyes. Not Daisy, but another soul that had been trapped in this nightmare. He reached out, letting the dog sniff his hand. You're safe, he whispered. No one will hurt you again. Behind them, the suspects were being loaded into police cars, shouting protests that fell on deaf ears. The operation was over. But the fight wasn't. As Dr. Carter looked at the dogs huddled together, he knew this was just the beginning. There were more out there, more that needed saving. And he would keep going, as long as it took. Dr. Carter sat in his office, staring at the photographs spread across his desk. The latest rescue had been a success, but it felt like a never-ending cycle. Every time they stopped one operation, another surfaced somewhere else. He rubbed his eyes and exhaled, exhaustion settling deep in his bones. Sarah walked in, holding 2 cups of coffee. She placed one in front of him without a word and took a seat across from him. She didn't have to ask how he was feeling. She already knew. We did good last night, she finally said, breaking the silence. Dr. Carter nodded. We did. He picked up his coffee and took a sip. But it doesn't feel like enough. Sarah leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. It'll never feel like enough. But look at what we've done. Look at the dogs we've saved. Dr. Carter sighed. I know. I just wish we could stop this for good. She gave him a sad smile. We can't save them all, James. But we saved these. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. It was Rebecca. Daisy? He asked immediately, his heart skipping a beat. She's doing great, Rebecca said. But I wanted to call because, well, I think she's ready for a home. Dr. Carter sat up straighter. Really? Rebecca laughed. Yes, she's playing with the other dogs, her confidence is growing, and she trusts people again. I think she's ready. A warmth spread through his chest. After everything Daisy had been through, she was finally ready to move on. She's come so far, Sarah said, listening in. She has, Rebecca agreed. And I wanted to ask, do you know anyone who might be interested in adopting her? Dr. Carter didn't even hesitate. I do. Sarah turned to him in surprise, but then a slow smile spread across her face. You? Dr. Carter nodded. I can't think of a better home for her. Rebecca chuckled. I was hoping you'd say that. She's already yours, James. 2 days later, Dr. Carter stood outside Rebecca's sanctuary, his heart racing as he watched Daisy bound toward him. She wasn't the same terrified dog he had first met. She was stronger now, more confident. When she reached him, she pushed her nose into his hand, wagging her tail softly. Hey, sweetheart, he murmured, kneeling down to stroke her fur. Ready to come home? Daisy licked his face, and for the first time since this all began, Dr. Carter let himself believe in happy endings. The fight wasn't over. There would always be more dogs to save, more battles to fight. But today, Daisy was safe, and that was enough. For now.